Hi, I'm Dr. J. Varma, and welcome to Thermometer. On this channel, I check the temperature of health in the US and around the world and give you expert insights on infectious diseases and public health. This is our weekly episode of Inside Outbreaks. And on these episodes, I review the latest outbreaks of infectious diseases, the outbreaks that you need to know about. And I do this with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jon Epstein, a veterinarian, virologist, and disease ecologist who, like me, has spent his career tracking dangerous infectious diseases across all corners of the earth. Thanks, Jon, for joining me today.
Thanks, Jay. How are you doing? Happy Tuesday.
Good, good. Yeah, I'm doing well. We're getting, a lot of times we talk about the weather and stuff like that. I've been really struck though, it's been really nice here lately, but
Yeah.
how one of the challenges that we're facing is that anytime it rains here, I feel like we're at risk of flooding. And I don't really remember that being the case 10 years ago when I was living in Florida.
No, I think the rain used to be more gradual. Now it seems like we get these bursts, these intense storms that lead to flooding in the subways or, just flooding other areas because of the amount of water we're getting in a short period of time.
Yeah, and one of the issues that you and I always talk about is how our health is really inextricably linked, to the animals and live organisms around us and our physical environment as well. And so, yeah, it's just been really striking to me over the past couple of years how that just impacts my daily life. Like just even commuting places. I was supposed to go to a show with some friends, and everybody was terrified that the subways would be flooded.
That's true. It's not just like, do I carry an umbrella when I'm going out to, not get wet, but now it's you got to get wet, worry about getting wet from the bottom up as
Yeah,
well.
no, without question as well too. And we're seeing that, and I know you and I have covered this topic before about the risks of flooding, and so it is something that we all need to be thinking about on a daily basis. Which kind of brings me to the first big topic of the day, which is a disease that also spreads through the air and has a link to the weather, because one of the ways that we live comfortably in the weather is by having indoor air conditioning systems. So the disease that I'm actually going to start us off with today is Legionnaires' disease. And you and I have talked about this once before
Yes.
in the context of cruise ships, right? We've talked about outbreaks on cruise ships. Well, it turns out that there's an outbreak here in New York City, and I have quite a lot of familiarity with Legionnaire's disease outbreaks in New York City. So on July 25th, the New York City Health Department announced that they were investigating what they called a community cluster of Legionnaire's disease in Central Harlem. The alert was originally based on 5 people being diagnosed with Legionnaire's disease within a few zip codes, all of whom were diagnosed after July 25th. But since then, the number of cases in this outbreak has grown, and there's now 58 people sick, and 2 of them have died.
Yeah. So Jay, you and I work in public health. So, we are familiar with the terminology, but cluster, right? When I think of cluster, I think it's a group of things together. But in terms of disease outbreaks, what is the difference between a cluster and an outbreak?
So the difference is that the term cluster sounds a lot better if you are an elected official and you're a political person and you're in City Hall and you're kind of nervous about calling it an outbreak. I mean, to
Unless
be
the
honest,
situation is a cluster F, and then it's like not a good thing to talk about.
yeah, that's exactly what this is. So when I used to run infectious diseases for the city of New York, this was a problem that I had to deal with. We at the health department, basically, public health people define an outbreak as basically any increase in the number of cases of a specific disease or condition during a specific time period that is greater than what you would expect under background or routine circumstances. So really, almost anything when there's an increase in the number of cases could be considered an outbreak. But that term made a lot of, our communications folks, particularly those who sit in City Hall and places, really nervous. So we used to talk about clusters. And the way I would explain this, because I then had to be the person to defend that, in front of the media and people asking this question. And I came up with a definition that I actually can live with. I don't think is scientifically inaccurate simply because there isn't much consensus on this. And basically the way I defined it as a cluster was when we detected an increase in cases due to some type of statistical algorithm or because of a sudden increase in reporting, but we didn't know enough to link those cases to a common source, right? Often when we're defining and describing an outbreak, we're referring not just to an increase in the number of cases over a specific time period, but we expect that they're all linked together in some way, right? There's a common exposure. So in this situation, often when we would use our statistical algorithms to detect a new increase in cases, like with Legionnaire's disease, we would call it a cluster at first. and then call it an outbreak once we had defined and proven that, in fact, there was a common source.
Okay, well, I think that's a fair distinction that it's clearly a group of cases above the norm, and we're waiting to see an epidemiological link or some common source of exposure and to then call it an outbreak where there's clear, kind of cause and effect to it.
Yeah, and I'm pretty comfortable with that, even though that was a definition that was kind of I had to sort of back my way into, as I said, because
Yeah.
and this is one of the biggest challenges in public health, right? We are starting everything we do in science, but everything we do has to be filtered through the lens of public policy. And that requires considering a whole range of other factors which have nothing to do with science. They have to do with, perception and acceptability and affordability.
Oh, it is just a fact of it's the nature of public health, and it's unfortunate, but it's something we all have to deal with. That public messaging and public reaction and response is an integral piece to public health in general. So we deal with politics when it comes to an outbreak in a certain geography that's going to implicate that place, whether it's a county in the U.S., a country in the world. Wherever there's some kind of locality or location to something bad happening, there's a residual impact. People get afraid to go there. It can impact tourism or commerce. And so that's where politics starts to come in. Like, just as a quick aside, I remember working years ago on a cluster of rabies disease cases in Australia. This was back in the 90s, and Australia is a rabies free country. And suddenly in 1996, they had 3 people who got infected and died from a rabies type virus. And it was called Australian bat lyssavirus. They all had exposure to bats that were rabid. But because of politics, they didn't want to call it rabies because that would imperil their rabies-free status as a country. So instead, this was a lyssavirus, which is the genus of virus that rabies belongs to. But it was rabies. It was clinically rabies. It worked like rabies. It was carried by animals that tend to carry rabies. So for all intents and purposes, it was. But that is what stuck, and it's kind of a running joke in the infectious disease community that ABL or Australian bat lyssavirus was really just a euphemism. But to your point, like sometimes you have to deal with the politics and public response while still effectively managing the public health aspect of it.
We deal with this all the time. Cholera outbreaks were known as what? Watery diarrhea, right? They weren't
Yeah.
called cholera because they would threaten the status. And this was true in Thailand. It was true in places in Africa that I worked. Yeah. So it's sort of what we deal with. So let's get back to Legionnaire's disease and let's talk a little bit about why this is worth talking about and why it's worrisome and why, if you're an elected official, the term cluster sounds a lot better than outbreak. The challenge is that Legionnaire's disease is a bacteria that causes, is a bacterial disease. So it's caused by a bacteria called Legionella bacteria, and it causes a pneumonia. And then pneumonia in, sort of the average person with like really good health, kind of gives them a flu-like illness. They get some headaches and muscle aches. They may feel short of breath and cough, but most people can actually recover without necessarily needing antibiotics. But if you have any type of impairment of your immune system, that can simply mean you're older than the age of 50, which unfortunately includes people like us, anybody with a weakened immune system in particular, and
Yeah.
anybody with any type of, pre-existing lung disease or smoker can get severely ill from this and be hospitalized. And what makes it particularly worrisome is not that it spreads person to person, but it actually spreads through the air. And we talked before about how people can get it on a cruise ship from a hot tub, a jacuzzi that hasn't been properly maintained. But there's a problem in cities. And John, do you know what a cooling tower is? Because to tell you the truth, I didn't actually know what a cooling tower was until I investigated a massive and deadly outbreak of Legionnaire's disease in New York City in 2015.
It kind of reminds me of misting stations on a more personal level where they're blowing droplets of water into the air to effectively cool something down. You think about when you walk through theme parks or public places and they're giant fans with water misters, and it's just to cool people down on a super hot day. But I imagine the cooling towers are that at a much bigger scale.
Yeah. So, every city in the world that has, buildings that have indoor air conditioning systems, right? Happens to have some type of device that sits on the top of the building that essentially absorbs heat that's generated by these internal heating and ventilation and cooling systems.
Okay.
And that heat is absorbed into water, which is kept in a cooling tower. And then that water can evaporate over time, right? It can absorb the water, the
Got it.
energy from there, and dissipate it without feeding it back into the building or something else. The problem is that these towers, then, if this water, once it's getting heated, what happens to water? It turns into particles, right? That'll float through the air. Now, if the lining of those cooling towers contains a film of bacteria, and we talked about in our previous episode about how Legionella can survive in these things called biofilms, right? These like
Right.
weird matrices that can exist on a surface where bacteria can kind of be hiding in between all bunch of other, chemicals and materials. That if these cooling towers have Legionella in them, when the water gets aerosolized, it sprays out. And it turns out there have been outbreaks, for example, in France, where bacteria have flown for miles and caused Legionella cases miles away from where the original cooling tower was.
Okay, so all it takes is a bit of a breeze and a hot day, and this water starts evaporating, and droplets get into the air and can carry the bacteria with it.
Yeah, and it spread out over a large range of people. So in 2015, we did we had a huge outbreak investigation. It was a really tragic, situation. It was also in Harlem, interestingly enough. And we have some great epidemiologists and statistical analysis who picked up this increase in cases, which can be hard to do. We can talk a little bit about diagnosis in a bit. And we had to figure out like where all these cases were coming from. And this was in an age before people were really using like GPS analysis very much. And there was no registry at that time of cooling towers. So we literally had our environmental health people scanning at maps. And basically we kind of mapped out where all the cases live. And we kind of just drew a circle around it and looked at a map and said, okay, well, where are there cooling towers in this? And
Mhm.
interestingly enough, if you just by visual inspection and by using some interesting statistical analysis about distance and the likelihood that people were getting infected, we kind of narrowed it down to one hotel in 2015 that most likely was the source. And sure enough, later when we sampled that cooling tower and looked at the genetic fingerprint of the bacteria, it was in fact that cooling tower. So these can
Wow.
require some pretty intensive investigative work. And it sounds like from what the health department released today, is that they don't know the source of this outbreak, but they do believe it's due to cooling towers. And they found 11 cooling towers that initially screened positive for Legionella when they sampled water and maybe the walls and the surfaces of them. So I've already started the process of remediating them. And that really basically means literally getting into these cooling towers and
Scrubbing them out.
scrubbing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
And you can imagine these are the tops of buildings. It's not like there are like lots of people out there, especially in the month of August, who have the expertise at cleaning out a cooling tower.
Yeah. Well, sorry, just clearing my throat. No, but it's
Is that
kind of
water?
goes
Is that
back to
water have some Legionella
yeah,
in it?
I'm pretty sure that's Legionella free, but I'll tell you in 48 hours.
Yeah.
It reminds me when we originally talked about Legionnaire's disease in the context of the cruise ships, we talked about the hot tubs and the fact that those biofilms can accumulate on a hot tub surface. And as the water bubbles and froths, it can put droplets into the air that can be inhaled by people. And I guess this is kind of a similar notion that biofilms form on the inside of these cooling towers. And it's not what I was envisioning in terms of active misting or spraying, but you're saying just as a byproduct of a hot environment, the water is evaporating and there are droplets being put out. So it's really necessary to make sure we're vigilant about cleaning these because over time, if you neglect it, that's when you get the accumulation of bad bugs inside, right? Inside these
Yeah, no,
environments.
that's exactly right. And before 2015, the city didn't have a registry of all of these, and there was no requirement that they be cleaned on a regular and ongoing basis. And this big outbreak, then, it's one of the reasons we in public health investigate outbreaks. The same reason the FAA investigates airplane crashes is we want to stop this from happening again,
Right.
right? And you can never stop it. A lot of these things completely, but you can reduce the likelihood of them. And so what happened was it began a process that eventually went through the city council to establish regulations to basically mandate that all cooling towers be registered with the city so you could find them, that they maintain inspection records. But again, these are hardy bacteria and they can find their way into there. And so the best you can do is help reduce the frequency of outbreaks. It's unlikely you can stop them completely altogether.
Yeah, and I guess going back to the people who are being infected and the symptoms of this is treatable, right, with antibiotics, which is the good news. And in the summertime, pneumonia is not so typical in terms of, when we think of respiratory diseases like pneumonia, it's wintertime thing. So when we start seeing an increase in cases in the summer, it makes us think about atypical causes of pneumonia. But then hopefully those people are reporting to clinics, doctor, or a hospital and getting treated. And they should be
Yeah.
okay.
And one of the reasons this ends up being, and I'll again give a window into the politics of this, is even if you remediate those cooling towers, the problem is this is a bacteria that has an up to 2-week incubation period. Okay.
Mhm.
So even if you have stopped the source, it may be 1 or 2 weeks until the number of cases goes down. So that's one thing. So first of
Right.
all, people have already been exposed and you don't know who everybody's been exposed. So you have a choice. You could try to give antibiotics to everybody, but it's talking about hundreds of thousands of people, or you wait. So first of all, cases are going to go up because people have been exposed. The second reason cases are going to go up is because, as you just mentioned, this is a disease that causes kind of flu-like and atypical symptoms. So a lot of times people don't necessarily get tested for it because people think that they have a viral infection like the
Mhm.
flu. And this isn't a bacteria that you have to run a specific test for. You have to do a urine test to look for the antigen or a specific culture test on a sputum specimen. And so the second thing that happens is the number of cases go up because doctors are suddenly on alert and they start testing a bunch of people for Legionella that they wouldn't already. So now, John, you are the mayor or you're another official in City Hall. And I say to you,
Hard
John,
pass. What?
yeah.
Yep.
So I said to you, hey, John, good news. We figured out the source of this cooling tower. So, so the outbreak should be over pretty soon.
Yeah, well, right. Except that because we can have these prolonged incubation periods, we're going to continue to see cases even when we take action. Not to mention that when we tend to focus on the tower we identify, there might be others we haven't gotten to yet that could be seeding other clusters or outbreaks.
Exactly. So like 2 days later, you call me up and you start screaming and you're like, what the hell? You just told me you got the cooling tower. Why
Yeah.
did the number of cases go from 50 to 80? And then I have to explain to you, well, sorry, there is an incubation period. So and number two, doctors are going to diagnose more. Right.
Yeah.
So these can be very, very contentious issues. And again, this is a severe illness and it preys, unfortunately, on the most vulnerable, people who have pre-existing medical conditions or advanced age and are also the least likely to necessarily seek out medical care.
Right.
And so these are things that it's great that we have, just to applaud. It's great that we invest in a city health department that has really extraordinary epidemiologists with advanced statistical methods, because a lot of places don't actually detect these outbreaks. So they're doing a good job of detecting them, but it's bad news if you live in those areas. And it's not the type of thing that goes away really quickly. There could be 1 or 2 more weeks here where the number of cases go up and people get sick. So if you know people that live in that area, you live in that area yourself, make sure you're advising anybody you know, particularly if they're older or a smoker, have any health conditions, that, hey, if they're getting an unusual respiratory illness, go see your doctor and mention that you're in an area where you might have been exposed to Legionnaire's disease.
Okay. And we'll pay attention to this and maybe we'll report back on it in a week or two and see how we're doing if there's news on the case count.
Yeah, and let's hope, of course, then maybe I'm wrong, and maybe they have peaked on the number of cases, but unfortunately, there's a way that these outbreaks tend to behave in a similar manner and things, and so so we need to be careful about the air we breathe. And John, it turns out we also need to be careful about the food we eat.
I
Now,
was wondering how you were going to segue into this next
I
topic.
I was, and I'm worried that we're being screwed.
That it was about a 4 out of 10, but I think you upped it to a 6 or 7 with that one.
Yes,
So,
exactly.
of
So,
course, you
John,
were talking about the impending wave of screwworm. Screwworm. Now, this is something probably most people haven't heard of. It sounds funny. It is not a horny worm, but this, in fact, is the larvae of a fly that is devastating to animals. This is something that we haven't dealt with in the United States for decades. It's a fly that lays larvae on the skin of animals, cows, horses, goats, and unlike maggots that will get into the open wounds of a dead animal, screwworm larvae will infect the skin of a live animal, and if there's any kind of cut, abrasion, or lesion, the larvae of this fly will burrow into the skin and cause incredible painful and damaging lesions on the animal. And the problem is that these flies lay hundreds of eggs on the skins of animals so that the larvae are there in huge numbers, and if it's not treated or if it's not dealt with ideally prevented, it could be fatal in the animals. So this is a devastating infectious disease in livestock, okay, from the larvae of these worms. Now, we used to have this in the United States, but it was eradicated through an intensive effort by our government and in cooperation with governments of Mexico and through Central America and the Panamanian government, using a technique which is pretty incredible called sterile insect technique, where we bred. It turns out if you release sterile male flies out into the environment, they will mate with the females and they will produce basically infertile eggs that never hatch into larvae. And that was how we controlled the population. And we drove screwworm back all the way down into South America. So Panama was like the front line of screwworm invasion. And for decades, since the 60s, we didn't have any screwworm cases north of Panama. But why we're talking about this and why this is a concern is that we have seen a breach in our defenses, a breach in the barrier, and we are starting to see the flies and screwworm infestations on livestock moving north through Central America, and in fact have gotten as far as parts of Mexico. And Jay, I think we have a map which we could help
Yeah.
visualize the sort of distances we're talking about, and it'll help folks understand why this is of great concern to the US agriculture. So remember, these are flies. So we talk about airborne diseases. This is an airborne insect that can move quite easily. And if it's not controlled, it will very quickly move into new environments. And we have livestock all the way through Mexico. And then, of course, we have a massive beef cattle industry. All of our farms are in Texas and other parts of the southern United States. And so the concern is this map is showing areas where there have been screwworm cases. And you can see in Mexico now it's advanced to as close as a couple hundred miles from the US border. And so this is causing all kinds of alarms in the US Department of Agriculture. And what we are doing about this is working in close cooperation with Mexico and Panama to try to ramp up production of these sterile flies, which was the effective technique for driving back, the population of screwworm flies. But it also requires vigilant surveillance. So that means active trapping around livestock and agricultural installations to see if the flies are around. So you have to identify that there are flies. And then, of course, controlling animal movement, because if you move infected animals across borders, that can introduce screwworm to new areas. And so a lot of people in the United States feel that it is inevitable that screwworm is going to get into the southern United States, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. And so in preparation for that, the Department of Agriculture has invested millions in sterile fly production facilities, both in Mexico and in Texas. And so they're trying to bolster production of these flies in preparation to try to prevent the spread of screwworm. Because once it gets into your animals, it can cause real bad damage. Number one, painful, horrible for the animal that's infected. There isn't a treatment, there's no drug you can give to clear an infestation of these larvae. And by the way, the reason they're called screwworm is that they literally burrow in a corkscrew fashion into the skin of the animal. And so they screw right down. And then in the process of chewing flesh while the animal's still alive, it causes a big lesion that can get infected, of course, with secondary infections and cause the animal to get sick and die. So this means millions and millions of dollars in veterinary costs and lost productivity to livestock, which is why the U.S. is so worried about screwworm, Jay.
Yeah, let's run through a couple of questions here then. So, John, I guess my first question is, let's play out the bad scenario. What is the bad scenario here in terms of screwworm infection making it across the border into the U.S. Cattle supply, particularly in Texas and that part of the United States? How damaging is it to the beef supply in the U.S. and what would you anticipate might happen? This is the bad case scenario.
Yeah. So worst case scenario is we start to see infections on these cattle stations that literally have millions of head of cattle, right? Huge stations. So now you have to go through over a big rangeland. You have to go through individual animals, see who's got infestations, who's infected. Very hard to treat. Again, there's no approved therapeutic for screwworm. So if you see an infestation, you can try to mechanically clean it, try to physically clean it up, and treat the wound. But if it's bad enough, you're having to cull animals, you're reducing your herd. Of course, productivity goes down. Animals that are infected, either with screwworm and then a secondary infection, will lose weight. There'll be less productivity. So it's a lot of lost money in terms of the yield of beef in these cattle. So it's a real concern.
And does it infect dairy cattle as well, too? I mean,
It can.
so essentially we're thinking about the same type of phenomenon where dairy cattle could be hit both by the risk of avian influenza, bird flu, but also from this parasitic infection as well.
Sure. Basically, any animal could be infected, and that includes domestic animals like cats and dogs too. If they
Okay.
were, out in the yard and got eggs laid on them and larvae, on them. So it can be really devastating. Now, fortunately, I guess it doesn't really affect humans. Like we don't see a lot of cases in people. It's possible, but typically not. So this is really a concern for livestock primarily,
Okay.
and it's an economic concern.
So let's go through the optimistic or the more optimistic or the proactive scenario here. So the proactive scenario here is that our USDA, let's hope that there are enough staff still in place and that there's funding and expertise still there, that they weren't cut by Doge before. But let's assume all of that. Where do you find a factory to produce sterile flies? I didn't realize that there were places like that.
There
Right?
are
Like,
sterile fly factories. Not they don't advertise, but they are there. And let's remember, Jay, that there are state interests here too. So the state of Texas, where the
yep.
beef industry is massive, will also invest money. And so, in addition to USDA, they're putting money into factories that will produce these flies. The USDA is cooperating with Mexico and with Panama to ramp up production. Now, here's the problem. Even starting today, even though these investments have been promised, it will take up to 18 months to build
Yep.
these new factories that,
Yep.
even optimistically, the one in Texas that is being scaled up, wouldn't be ready till the end of the year. So that is 6 months of time for the flies to propagate, to move. So again, there's a bit of a lag here, but it is a necessary investment if we really want to take this seriously, which I believe we are, Jay. And remember, three important elements to really try to control and prevent cases. Number one, surveillance. So in addition to these fly factories, we have to commit to trapping around farms, understanding where the flies are. In Mexico at this point is sort of the northernmost range. Controlling animal movement. So something that's happened in the past 4 months is the USDA has on again, off again, cut off importation of animals from Mexico, closed the border so that infected animals wouldn't come through. They reopened it briefly, I believe back in May, and then closed it again. So they're really trying to monitor and assess what the risk is of animal movement. And so controlling animal movement. And then there is, of course, the release of the sterile flies. And I think the goal is to try to push these screwworm flies back southward through Central America and ultimately, again, have Panama as the front line here and try to contain it. But as of now, these flies are throughout Central America and into Mexico.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, John, I mean, I'm glad that we discussed this topic because I think that even though this may seem esoteric to the average person, and it's something that I actually had never known about, I mean, it's just a perfect example about how, like, to survive, we need food and air and water. And we just talked a few minutes ago about the risks associated with air and water systems and our environment. And here's another example of things that are in our food supply, and that we need this infrastructure to keep us all safe. And it's an infrastructure that tends to be quiet, that even people like myself who work on public health aren't even paying attention to something like that because it doesn't normally infect humans directly, right?
Right.
But it's just another example about how all these systems are necessary and important in place, and they may seem odd and wasteful, but the reason you have the ability to ramp up a sterile fly factory is to prevent your beef supply from being destroyed. And so I'm glad to know that there is this infrastructure that's still in place, and that hopefully it will keep us all safe. But even more important for all of us, just to be aware that these are all the types of systems we want to keep promoting and saving out there.
That's right. And it's, yet another example that we take for granted a lot of these systems when things are going well and we're not experiencing outbreaks of diseases, clusters of diseases. It's great. But when we let down our guard, when we start to break these systems down, when we stop paying attention, that's when infections, infectious diseases, vectors all have the chance to ramp back up. So it does require continuous vigilance and investment.
Great. And on that note, John, we're going to close our episode. If anybody out there listening and watching, if you like this episode, if you enjoy what we're talking about, hit the like button, hit subscribe, please share it with other people. We're out there to make sure we can all enjoy our lives, in a healthy way and have lots of great nutritious food to eat as well too. So staying abreast of these issues is important, and it's obviously important to let your friends and neighbors know about it as well too. All right, John, thank you
Right.
very much. Great. We'll see you
Until
next
next
week.
time, hopefully no Legionnaires, and we'll see you next week.
Yep. Keep people updated. Bye bye.
Bye.